Okay, thank you very much for everyone who is here. My panelists, it's 7 o'clock, so let's begin. Um, we would like
Okay,
to
thank you very much for everyone who is here. My panelists is
sorry, I was hearing myself as an echo, so I had to turn off my phone. Okay, so we would like to welcome our viewers who are already online, and the parents of various groups who are tuned in to hear our very pertinent discussion. We would like to thank the CDI for providing yet another opportunity to have this conversation with you today, particularly it being Mental Health Week. And we recognize that this year, Toronto Board of Health declared anti-Black racism a public health crisis. However, we believe that this recognition alone is not sufficient if there are not adequate resources that are pumped into ensuring that Black families and other families can manage the mental health challenges that affects them. So while it is good to give name to any issue, it is far better to provide resources to help families help to combat some of the challenges that they're facing. Even though we're having this discussion during the pandemic, we don't want to minimize the discussion to the pandemic as if anti-Black racism or mental health crisis only is only evident in this time. We do recognize that COVID-19 did shed a light on it and magnify the issues that we experience. But we recognize that, we're at, a stage where serious decisions have to be made, or else, given the pandemic, given the suffering and the loss, things will be further exacerbated if there's nothing put into effect. Before we go further in our discussion, I do want to do our land acknowledgement because it's in keeping with respecting the Indigenous rights to the land and also in keeping with anti-Black racism practices, anti-Black, racism action work. Okay, so we want to acknowledge that the land that we're meeting on, albeit online, is a traditional territory of many nations, including Mississaugas of New Credit. We have the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Shawnee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home of many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of New Credit. We acknowledge that we inhabit Indigenous lands, and as inhabitants on this land, we are obligated to treat the land with respect and promote restorative justice for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And oftentimes in our discussions about anti-Black racism and strategies to combat this form of racism, we also highlight the racism faced by Indigenous people because we know that racism just does not affect one set of people, although we recognize, given the statistics, that Black people have really been severely affected by anti-Black racism and white supremacy. Okay, so I have today with me my colleagues, my distinguished colleagues. We have Annette Walker, who is a PhD candidate in the final rounds of her PhD working on her dissertation. Go, Annette. She's studying at Western University. She's a former teacher in Jamaica, a researcher, and her focus is in leadership and well-being. We have Janelle Brady, PhD candidate, who is also finishing up her PhD at OISE, University of Toronto. She's an anti-racist educator, researcher, and CDI SNAP Homework Club. And we changed the name recently to SNAP CESA, but we'll get into that later, right, Janelle? Curriculum developer and academic support. And we have joining us on our second go around, we have Dr. Leah Edwards. He is a social worker, clinician, and educator specializing in mental health and substance misuse. Okay, so before we get into the meat of the matter, let us do a recap. I know we had a presentation in July, and there have been subsequent presentations after that that looked at anti-Black racism, giving a definition for racism as well. Let us do a recap and define our key terms, as we know that there's a tendency in the media for racism to be conflated with discrimination and stereotyping, which minimizes the effect of the act. So, Annette, could you please provide us with a framing of racism? Annette, you have to unmute. I know you have a lot of knowledge spewing out of your mouth. But please unmute.
Oh my God, apologies. I forgot to unmute. Hi, everyone. You know, as we had discussed in the second CDI talk, we mentioned that, racism is essentially about power. And two of our leading researchers, especially George Day, he has actually connected racism with power and knowledge reproduction. And so people like James Jones, including George Day, they both connected, or they both look at racism as, one group essentially having the belief that they're more superior than, racialized groups. So then racism within the context of what we're essentially discussing this evening, it moves beyond the individual. So it's more structural and systemic, where it exists in institutions such as the public healthcare system, education. It looks at, the ideologies and social systems that essentially it perpetuates inequity among different racial and ethnic groups. So this type of racism, it often leads to what we call disparities in health because of manipulative practices that usually affect individual rights and access. And so we also want to give recognition to a PhD person, Vance, who mentioned that, and this is a quote, given that Black community exists at the intersection of race, classism, and health inequity, their mental health needs are often exacerbated and most unfulfilled. Issues related to economic insecurity and the associated experiences such as violence and criminal injustices further serve to compound the mental health and disparities of the Black population. So I think that is really, really important for us to mention, given that, as we say, it's Mental Health Week. So then what is essentially clear is that systemic racism, it affects Black and other people of color mental health in numerous ways, which then has, influence on their physical well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. Does anyone else want to share? Janelle, Miss Anti-Racist Educator, do you have anything to add?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Shawnee, and thank you so much, Annette, for providing that framework. So we have the example, the recent example of Joyce Echequan, a First Nations woman who died in a Montreal hospital not too long ago. But really, it goes back to the example of this unfortunate and, again, unnecessary death. Goes back to the example of what Annette has pointed to in terms of racism and the pieces of power regarding racism. As well, it also shows how microaggressions are normalized, and they result in the death and loss of life of people who are Black, who are Indigenous, and who are racialized. And you could see here the example of a woman from the intersectional framework, someone who is a woman and First Nations, being disregarded, and her life, frankly, not mattering. So the question that people have is, had this been a white woman or a white person, would she have died at the hands of those who are supposed to be providing care and who had these very racist and discriminatory and sexist comments? So these are the questions that come to mind, and really it's about making the connections to anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism. There are a lot of people in the Black community whose microaggressions are normalized, like just going into the healthcare system, going in for a doctor's appointment, you have to justify your humanity, and that just becomes a part of your daily interaction and experience. So that's where it ties back to the points that Annette has made regarding power with racism.
That is a very good point, Janelle, because we recognize that even the Ontario Human Rights Commission recognizes that there's racism entrenched in the healthcare system, especially relating to racialized Black and Aboriginal communities. And I've read a newspaper article in which this this Black woman was commenting that she went into the hospital and she was dressed a particular way and nobody wanted to provide service for her, right? So even occupying certain spaces, if you don't look quote unquote professional, then people treat you a particular way, even in the healthcare sector. Okay, so let's get to the meat of the matter and the discussion at hand. So now that, Janelle, you've provided that example, let's have further discussion as to how racism affects Black people's mental health. And we recognize that, of course, although we have, there are 4 of us on the panel, I have to check my math just now, that we have different lived experiences. We have, we have different experiences in Canada, outside of Canada, but we don't want to present these issues as if they're a monolith and as if all Black people experience the same issues. So we'll be drawing on the literature, we'll be drawing on media reports, we'll also be drawing on our lived experiences, and our research to provide these answers, but just recognizing, as I said, people experience mental health and racism in different forms, and we want to give voice to that. Okay, so Leo, I'll start off with you. In your perspective, from your research and from your own experiences, how do you think anti-Black racism affect Black people's mental health?
Thank you, Shawnee, for the question. And it's certainly a privilege to be on this live with some really powerful Black women. It is really important to have community, and I'm always really proud to be with community. So thanks for having me, and thanks for CDI for putting on this much necessary conversation. So racism is indeed a key contributing factor in the onset of disease, and is responsible for the increasing disparities in health outcome among Black people. The burden of racism, in addition to other intersections like poverty and other socioeconomic factors, can continue to pose a risk for both the mental health and, to some extent, the physical health of Black people. Bearing in mind, when we talk about mental wellness, we're talking about a balance in our emotional, social, physical, environmental, and for many within our community, our Black community, spiritual aspects of our life. And so when those areas aren't in harmony, when there is some unbalance or some disruption, it can affect our mental wellness. Bringing in as well the current situation with COVID-19, we see from the media, we know from our personal experiences that it is affecting racialized Black communities, Indigenous and Brown communities, much more than the dominant sectors of our society. And in addition to that, we also know that people are dying, and many aren't able to grieve, to say goodbye in a way that's meaningful. So considering all of these systemic and lived experiences, Black folks, their mental health for sure can be compromised. In addition, just drawing on some statistics from Black Health Alliance, although Black Canadians represent about 3% of the population here, almost 20% live in poverty. And it is over 60% of Caribbean folks are more likely to experience psychosis. This kind of differential treatment is pervasive and is evident not only in our justice system, not only in systems of education and housing and health. It is pervasive across all of these systems. And although Black folks, let me say this differently. I should emphasize that Black people, that we're not responsible for the existence or experience of racism, but we have this unfair burden. We have this burden with this responsibility of coping with the painful experiences of these oppressive experiences. Research has shown that experiencing internalized racism can have significant impact on one's mental health. So just as racism, and I'll put this in broader context because I think it's important. Just as racism is a system of structural advantage that privilege the white community, so white privilege, you have that advantage. Internalized racism is a result of structural disadvantage, and that can affect Black, brown, and Indigenous folks. So in other words, Black people are victimized by racism and they can internalize it. It means then that internalized racism is systemic oppression. And because it is, here are some ways it can affect our mental health. First, internalized belief. So this conscious and unconscious acceptance of the common racial tropes can lead to low self-esteem and increased symptoms of psychological distress. So you're a thug and you're no good, you're a hoe, and all these types of things can have an impact on Black folks' psychological well-being. Also, there's increased risk of depression. And although in a community we may not use the language of depression, we may hear from our mom and dad and grandparents, I'm not feeling well, I feel so, I'm worried. All of these are depression. And because of the experience, the systemic and internalized experience of racism, that can cause increase in depression. There could also
Leo, if I might add that, drawing back to history in terms of slavery, we weren't given and allowed to feel depressed. We had to get up every morning and produce. So then when you're not feeling well, you just have to produce. So even so, I think some people still have not adopted that language, you know.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Which talks as well about transgenerational trauma and how that shows up in our parenting and the way that we take care of our own mental health. In addition to these points that I made, there's also increased levels of anxiety related to the stress. Think about a light switch. You put it off and on, off and on, off and on. Eventually, your light switch is going to blow. Similar to our body and our psychology. If you constantly in this stage of flight or fight, where you're questioning what you're feeling, it's possible that you may have increased high blood pressure and other other nervous system problems. So all of these are representations of how racism can affect our mental health. In addition, substance misuse. And again, it's important that we don't victimize people that are experiencing substance misuse issues, but frame it in the context of the history. Perhaps it's obviously not the most appropriate way to cope, but it's a way people feel they can experience. Oh, unless Willis going off there. The pleasures of working from home. As well as racial battle. There's another one called racial battle fatigue. How many of you, when there is a shooting on the TV, you start questioning, please, not another Black person, there's this hypervigilance that can happen. And all of this constant real estate that you have to use in your head can really have an impact on your sense of self, your self-esteem, and can cause feelings of shame and guilt and worthlessness, etc.
Right, Leo, well said. I feel as if you were preaching there, but thank you very much for all that information. Annette, do you have anything to add in terms of how racism, speaking from your research on well-being, how does anti-Black racism affect Black people's mental health?
Let me unmute. Yes, thanks for the question, Shawnee. Thank you, Leo. That was very informative. And what I'm about to share essentially overlaps with what Leo just said too. That there's a stark disparity in mental health among Blacks, right, and other people of color when you compare it with the white community. And again, just to reinforce what he said, it's just due to, as we said, due to systemic racism, which the research has shown to, it has disproportionately influenced Black children, youth, and adolescents, with evidence indicating, that there's an increased number of suicide and other adverse mental health issues among our youth, right? And so what the evidence has indicated then is that the gap is essentially widening when you look at at ages 5 to 12, right, between Black and white children, with some of the mental health issues that Leo mentioned, the anxiety and the depression and, the hypervigilance and all these kinds of things. So, just to mention again, what has actually been contributing to these issues, is the generational trauma. And we have to keep reminding ourselves and talking about this, the trauma from the colonial period, from slavery, and the generational trauma in and of itself, remembering too that some adults and parents, they have not learned how to develop and the art of understanding their own feelings and how they have dealt with different oppression. And so if you're not careful, which we'll discuss further down, we'll talk about strategies, but if you're not careful, you're going to transfer some of your own anxieties to your kids, right? And so the injustices and the atrocities, these things have actually led to, even what we're seeing, we're witnessing with some of our Black bodies being murdered right in front of our eyes. When kids sit and they watch these things, it affects you, right? You're on the road and you're walking like myself. I see a police car the other day and I started wondering, oh my God, are they going to stop me? So these are real issues, all right? But nonetheless, what we must not fail to mention is the resilience of Black people. The literature has shown that we're a resilient group. We're able to overcome, when compared to our white counterparts, right? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Annette. Janelle, I'll give you the closing remarks. So from your own work, which I know you've been doing a lot of work in this area, particularly looking at racism, anti-Black racism, and providing strategies. And I also know that you and I work on the SNAP program. So it's interesting that Annette highlighted the Middle Ages, because the SNAP for boys and girls focuses on the Middle Ages and provide useful mental health strategies for families. And we are now providing culture responsive approaches funded by MCCSS, Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services. I get a gold star for remembering that. So in 5 different Black serving organizations, 3 of these being in the Greater Toronto area. So I know from your work that you would have a lot to relate about how racism affect Black people's mental health.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Shawnee. And I have to remember, when the physical distancing era that we're in is over, I have to remember to give you a sticker for remembering the acronym, because usually people just say that acronym and they never remember. So one of the hallmarks of mental well-being issues among the Black community is the cyclical effects of trauma on children. And Leo had mentioned this in the points presented earlier. And what we have is really parenting for survival. So we have this, and Annette had mentioned this as well, but we have this transgenerational aspect of parenting where it's not just parenting and in this day and age thinking about baby proofing the house and how am I going to keep my kids busy during COVID and that sort of thing. There's the extra layer and burden of how am I going to ensure that my children survive? How am I going to ensure that they survive the education system, which is racist? How do I ensure that they survive multiple systems, which is systemically racist as well? And how do I ensure that they survive police brutality? So that's where now there's a lot more, I would say, literacy around privilege and white privilege, to Leo's points earlier and Annette's framing of the conversation. But what you really see is there are certain conversations that Black parents have to have with Black children that other parents who are non-Black do not have to have these same conversations with their children. So how to respond and react to police, how to go through a convenience store. And I find myself trying to ensure that, my hands are out and open, or I keep the receipt. And I do all of these things that are just normalized that many of us do. And we pass these things on to our kids. But this survival parenting, too, does come with a lot of trauma. And Leo has laid out all of the mental well-being issues that would arise as well regarding anxiety. And I do remember, like, when I was a child growing up, from my mother, my mom coming from Jamaica to Canada at a very young age, still carried a lot of the survival parenting methods, because she wanted the very best for me, and she wanted to ensure my safety and that I would thrive and survive in these systems. And one of the things she would say is, like, move your hand fast now. Like, if I'm just like in the kitchen and I'm slowly moving around, she'd be like, no, like, you have to hurry up. And days where she felt so or worried or stressed, as Leo said, she would just say, you just have to cut and go through, right? So these are the survival strategies and tactics that Black parents have. And as they're battling microaggressions, and as they're battling racism in their daily lives, and as they have to put on this professional face, they have to present themselves in these ways, as you said, Shawnee, it gets transmitted to their children and their children's well-being. And we cannot forget the impacts of COVID-19. This is all over the media. And Leo has pointed out the aspects of grief earlier as well. But it has had disproportionate impacts on Black, Indigenous, and in the States, more so, Latinx communities. And we see, the conversations coming out. Earlier today, I heard Cheryl Prescott, the executive director of Black Creek Community Health Center on CBC News, speaking to this specific issue of the disproportionate health impacts on the Black community, because there's intersection where race and socioeconomic disadvantage is coming to play. And COVID has just, as Shawnee says, has exacerbated these problems. But what does this mean in terms of the parents who Shawnee spoke to, that we support in the SNAP CISA program? What does this say about the choices or lack thereof that they have when it comes to their children? And at the end of the summer, we started to see a lot of the families and children that we're supporting in this culturally relevant program that who are frontline workers and who have limited choices with regards to care for their children. And with less subsidized programs, childcare programs available in the summer, also now for after school and before school care, these parents are put into very tough decisions. And they have, like I said, limited choices. They don't have access to all of these, access to jobs where they can work from home. They're being pushed out into the front lines. So, like adults, children also need social integration. And we've seen where a lot of children have taken on the stressors of COVID-19. They've taken on the stress of police brutality with the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, and many others. And they've internalized it. And it's led to further, the isolation has doubly impacted these young kids. And when I say these kids, these are kids who are, like Shawnee said, from the Black community. And you see there's a lot of anxiety in terms of going out for walks with family, where they're trying to mitigate, but they're worried about going out for walks because of, one, COVID-19. I remember one of the children that we support, one, COVID-19 is a big fear, and two, the police are another fear. And these are kids who are, not even the age of 12 yet, and they're taking on these stressors. So you could really see the impacts of racial trauma and the intersections of mental health well-being and racism kind of coming to the fore, especially when it comes to children, because it's not only the stress that parents are carrying out, but how does that then impact the children and the kids?
All right, thank you, Janelle. I'm wondering if we could speak a little bit more, since you've segued into looking at anti-Black racism and children. Speak a little bit more about that topic, especially given your experience in the SNAP CISA, socio-emotional education and school advocacy. It's a mouthful, but we do all of that and more. And then I'll open it up to Leo and Annette to speak a little bit more from their own experiences.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And Shawnee, another gold sticker. You know all the acronyms. That's incredible. Okay, so it's the little things, right? So some of the ways that the Black students we support are impacted is or affected by COVID-19, mental health and well-being, is there overrepresentation in the welfare system. So Black and Indigenous children are overrepresented in systems of care. Quite simply, I would say because the systems, education system, policing system, they all work together with the care system, and they don't really understand our ways of knowing or our ways of parenting or responses to racism. So for myself, growing up, I would spend a lot of time at aunts' homes, at the homes of my aunts after school, but that would be seen as like neglect because these were not biological aunts, and it was one place to the other. And that's in the Canadian white parenting style, that's not seen as quote unquote good parenting. But it comes from a social model of community care, right? The other piece is how children, youth, and adolescents are disciplined within the educational institutions. These things have an impact on their mental health. We've seen studies where youth have said, with Carl James has conducted studies where youth have said in their teenage years that they don't feel a sense of belonging in the education system. They don't want to be in the school walls. And that's horrible, right? That's pretty heartbreaking because that's telling us that the instances of over policing, higher levels of suspension, over discipline, higher levels of suspension, expulsion from school, also not being seen as good enough or smart enough for various academic programs. That takes a toll on Black youth and Black children, and they will say that they don't want to be within those school walls, right? So that is affecting their mental health. We can also see the intersections between race and class. And like I said earlier, Black families have highest unemployment rates, even when they have higher levels of post-secondary education. Among their peers, their unemployment rates are double of non-Black people. And they also struggle economically with housing as well, right? So this affects people in terms of housing, being precariously housed, but also we have to think about the ways that people have multi-generations within homes too. And when we look at COVID-19 and the need for virtual classes, space and resources then become an issue as well. So parents are having to feel like they need to solve all of these systemic issues on their own. And it creates a lot of stress for the parents and caregivers where they feel like they're not being good enough, they're not being attentive, because the people who thrive and do well within the pandemic are people who have access to the resources to thrive and do well in the pandemic, as in spaces where they can social isolate, right, or physically distance. So this creates mental health concerns for the students because we've seen this in the summer leading up to the fall with the children and families that we support in the SNAP CISA program. You know, access to tablets, access to contacting now with the school year, contacting teachers. These are not all things that are afforded to everyone. And sometimes children are having to work off their parents' phones and not complete, certain studies. And there were examples of, and educators are doing their absolute best. We know that, but there were examples of students being sent homework that requires a printer, and not all children have access to a printer during the COVID-19 lockdown. And these are things that disproportionately impact our students. And finally, many of you might have heard of learning pods, right? Not all children have access to these learning pods. This tends to give preference to middle to upper class children, as well as time to study.
Okay, thank you very much, Janelle. And I could just add that, after speaking to one of our parents in the SNAP CISA, she explained that her son was experiencing anxiety because he wasn't able to ask questions of the teacher. So the teacher would send the work, which from my experience, they typically send it weekly. But in this student's case, he wasn't getting access to the teacher beyond that. So there was no way for him to double check. And luckily, our tutors are awesome. So once we had him set up with a tutor, that level of anxiety and confidence in his schoolwork, that level of anxiety decreased, and he became more confident and wanted to do his schoolwork. And we were able to offer this service via telephone initially because we were still figuring out how do we do this service ethically, right? And students were still engaged, which show the need for such a service and educational equity. If parents are willing to access tutoring via the telephone for their children. Okay, so I know I said I was going to open it to you, Annette and Leo, but given the time, I think we should move on because we want to provide space for questioning as well. So let's jump right into the strategies. So we've discussed at length the ways in which anti-Black racism affects Black people in general. We've pivoted to speak a little bit about children and youth. So based on the discussion that we had prior, what are some practical strategies or resources that we can give in general, or things that needs to be highlighted for us to be able to have better mental health in the Black community? And when speaking of these strategies, let us frame our discussion to cover more system-based strategies, because as you stated, Leo, Janelle, and Annette, this wasn't a problem that Black people created on their own, but still we're made to, especially working class people, are made to bear the burden of a system that they didn't create and they're not benefiting from. So what would a system approach look like? As well as what strategies can we provide from a community-based approach, and then we'll get into more insular family-based approach, because we want to make it practical and applicable for different situations. Okay, so I start with you, Leo. What are some of the recommendations that you would make?
Thanks, Shawnee. Indeed, this is a structural issue and a systemic issue that would require a systemic and structural response. I think it's important for us to move on the continuum a bit away from being culturally sensitive and culturally aware to a point of being culturally responsive in a way that is very intentional and in a way that includes community. So first off, I think it would be important that there is some conversation or some framing around Afrocentric and Indigenous perspective around managing and holding mental health and healing. I think it is important to recognize the history of anti-Black racism, as well as the impacts of slavery, the residual impacts and how it shows up for Black people. And so considering that, I think a greater emphasis should be placed on anti-Black racism, but as well, including and bringing in Indigenous perspectives. In addition, I think there should be, for many in education spaces, school, psychology and social work, and those are inherently based in white supremacy and from Western perspective. I feel like there is a need for funding to bring in other perspectives from Black, Indigenous, and people of color in psychiatry and psychology and social work, considering our lived experience and lived realities. I feel that kind of intentional cultural responsiveness is important. I'm sort of at the point where I'm exhausted about cultural competence and cultural sensitivity. I think it's time for us to become much more reactive and responsive. Additionally, sort of going back to the first point, we need to sort of move away from the Western Eurocentric approach that centers on individual to consider the experiences of community. Black people, we're a community, we're very orally based. And so if you're gonna take care of my mental health, it's really about bringing community involved. How much of you, when you go to the doctor, your grandparents and moms and everybody goes, it's a very different, our experiences, Black folks, are very collective, very from a collectivist perspective and not so much from an individual perspective. So I feel like there should be a shift away from that kind of Eurocentric individual approach to one that considers community. On that point as well, because we're community-based, I think it's important for us to form alliance and collaboration with other community agencies. For example, CAFCAN, where there's this mission and vision around supporting and healing Black people mental health and wellness. That would be really, really important. And because no man is an island, because we're very much community-based, it would be important that we check in on our family members and members within our community. Those that sometimes appear to have it together, sometimes it makes sense to still check in. So check in on your neighbor, check in on your friend. That is what our ancestors would have done. They really formed community to deal with the system of racism and the violence, the brutal violence that they were up against. And I think for many as well, there should be a greater focus on spirituality and spirituality broadly, not really talking about religion. Religion in itself has been used as an oppressive way, and in fact, contributed to the stigma within our community around mental health. Because if you present with a psychosis, you either have a demon or you're possessed by Satan. So considering those, there should be greater reference around spirituality and getting in touch with our inner self to bring about the balance that is so necessary, especially in this day of COVID, anti-Black racism, state violence, discrimination and racism across sectors. Black folks, it would be really important that that they find and ground themselves within. And I think those are some practical things we can pay attention to.
Thank you so much. Those are some awesome points. Wanting to reinforce that we do need more resources from a system. It's enough to recognize it, and it's so important when money is needed for other stuff that's affecting the white community, that money is found, and still mental health, anti-Black racism. The government is giving loan, the federal government is giving loan and to businesses, Black businesses, instead of offering grants or money that people can use to invest in their communities. So that make us question the commitment to these anti-Black racism and also building wealth and lowering those income disparity if you're going to be offering loans to people. Janelle, before I get carried off on a tangent, what are some of the practical ways in which we can, strategies that we can use, from a community base?
Yes, thank you so much, Shawnee and Leo, for those points. I think the commitment piece is really important, and also the piece around community responses, right? That's very, very important as well. So thank you for those points. I would say further to that representation matters. So having Black children being able to see themselves, reflected in all positions, but I'm going to speak to the schooling position. For educators, for administrators, it's so important for them to see themselves reflected for a positive and healthy sense of self. The other is the internalization of anti-Black racism and its impact on Black children, particularly Black boys, where they're meeting the juncture of hypermasculinity, as well as internalizing anti-Black racism, and what are the impacts in terms of how they would quote unquote be acting out. So Carl James speaks about Black children and boys who are labeled as at risk. And also Carl James published, co-authored on a publication on race and well-being. I'll link it in the chat later, in 2010, which looked at these the specificities of these issues too. But also, when we speak about the internalization of anti-Black racism, we need to think about the intersections of race and gender and class that we've spoken to, as well as sexuality, as well as disability, and other markers of oppression or other aspects of social difference from the dominant mainstream understandings. So I think about Crenshaw's report, Kimberly Crenshaw, on Black Girls Matter. And I think these reports and these studies and these books are also really good resources for people, because the report really points to how Black girls are invisible, become invisible, right? With schooling, a lot of the emphasis and Black men, in mainstream media, Black heterosexual men. We need to think about Black women, Black girls, Black trans people as well, and how this affects their mental health as well. So it cannot just be a single track conversation. Another important piece, I would say, is advocacy. So there are a number of advocacy campaigns. Recently, the Children's Mental Health of Ontario organization put on a campaign of Kids Can't Wait, and they spoke to the long wait list of, I think, over 20,000 children who were trying to access mental health supports in the province. With a lot of these advocacy campaigns, they tend to have like an umbrella focus of mental health. And we need to have a focus that is specific and targeted, not just culturally sensitive, like Leo said, I love that, but culturally responsive, and look specifically at the particular instances of anti-Black racism and how we can use that lens to support Black families, Black children, and Black youth when we're thinking about mental health. So it cannot just be a neutral approach, because when it's neutral, that's where it tends to have a focus on what Shawnee is saying, on white families, on white communities, because whiteness is seen as a neutral construct within society. The other piece is that your vote matters, right? So school trusts have a huge say in terms of what is supported within the school system, what is not, who is hired, who is not, in terms of the admin and the educators. So this is also very, very important. MPs, MPPs, and local government is a big piece regarding how we can support Black people and how we can think about mental health strategies for Black people. And I think about points that Baden, who's supporting putting on this Ask CDI series, had mentioned in our chats prior to. One of the things that Baden mentioned is just picking up the phone and calling your local MPP and asking what position is on Black mental health strategies, and then not just voting, but thinking about how this can be long-term and between the years. And finally, I'll just end off with one more point, and that is the collection of race-based data. We really push for the collection of race-based data and use that for funding for Black people and ensuring that there is Black mental health strategies for Black youth, Black families, and Black people, but we don't have the data. And it's only social movements. I just want to have a disclaimer. It's the social movements that fuels the data, not just sitting on a shelf and collecting dust. So collecting the data is one thing, but the social movements that we saw with Black Lives Matter in the summer is what's actually going to push the data into action.
Okay, thank you, Janelle. I do know yes, I want to emphasize that girls are often left out of the conversation because there's a common understanding that girls do better at school, and girls are more, well, there's a common perception that they're more, able to follow the rules, as if it's the rules that allowing the boys to be pushed out, or it's the boys being unable to do well at school is causing them to be pushed out, without looking at larger systemic issues. And even so, I think because boys are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, the data does tend to focus more on girls. Sorry, on boys. But I would share, last year we were speaking to parents before we started the staff CISA, and this one parent shared that her daughter, she really wanted us to build confidence, her daughter's confidence, because she saw that she was questioning whether or not she was beautiful. And the mom started growing her hair natural to kind of be that model for the daughter, because she was saying, I don't think my hair is beautiful. And you have to think about, where are they getting these perceptions from? And thinking about, what are the books that we're using at school as educators? What are the conversations that we're having? How do we normalize beauty in the lessons and the plans that we use, even on the media? What are the images that's showing up of who is beautiful on the media in these advertisement campaigns and all of that? Is it of Black bodies with hair like mine? Those type of stuff. Okay, Annette, over to you. What are some of the strategies that we can use? We've been speaking a lot about, community-based strategies and system-wide strategies. But do you have anything else to add in addition to what Janelle and Leah had shared?
Thanks, Shawnee. Yes, I do. Just to mention that, as Janelle and Leah stated, that we need to come together as a collective in the Black community, to support our Black families. And but it's not restricted just to that. I think we need to forge stronger allies. Allyship is very, very crucial. Again, as Janelle said, when you look, even with the march in the States here, we're not only seeing Black people, those days are over. It's now, a rainbow of people, right? And so in emphasizing, we need to really form that strong allyship. And so I think a few things that we can consider is, people who are non-Black in their own communities. I think it's important that, we be very, very intentional in how we forge meaningful relationships with others, right? And so in our last CDI talk, we spoke much about having social capital, expanding your social networks, right? And I think when you have allyship, it helps to build trust and community so that you can share ideas. And I think one of our panelists mentioned that, it takes a village. And I think we need to reinforce that as well. It takes a village to create change. Change doesn't just happen. And when we think about power, who has the power, right? But if we as a collective come together, then those who have the power recognize that change is needed. And so as allies from different races within the social network, it can help to empower people, to seek solutions about mental health. It will help you to create more of a just society, so to speak. And so we know for a fact as well that allies have access to different audience and opportunities that sometimes, because of inequity in the system, Black families, Black people don't necessarily have. And so that will play, quite a significant role in working on anti-Black racism and mental health. So I think, both are essential and needed at this time so that we can have not just, I think it's important that we have meaningful and lasting solution. Another thing is that it's important that you also seek out webinars about anti-Black racism, especially during this time with COVID. We don't have to restrict ourselves. Things are more accessible, right? So seek out those webinars about anti-Black racism and mental health and engage. And when we talk about engagement, be very meaningfully engaged, and this will essentially, help you to understand more about what are some of the barriers that are preventing people from getting that equity and that social justice that we're essentially fighting for. And an example that I'll give is, you can be a part of the Black Mental Health Day. That's a very, very good opportunity for you to start that step, take that new step, right? Just to back on some of what Janelle and Leo mentioned, engaging in civic duty is very, very important, and volunteering, right? And voting is integral. And as we talk about from the onset of our conversation about, vulnerable population, Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, there's a lack of resources in communities, especially those outside of certain urban areas too, right? And so you need those resources. So it's not just about having equity in terms of human resource, but equity in terms of resources that will help people. And when you talk about the suspension expulsion, I worked on the project that looked at it in Ontario. And I'm telling you, I didn't even remember until last night. So much going on in my head. But I'm telling you, when I looked at the data at the time, it was so alarming to see how some of the feedback that principals and teachers and some of the paraprofessionals were giving about the kids' mental health. And the fact that sometimes even those who are in the position as leaders to really implement some of these policies, they don't necessarily, it's like there's a gray area. So when you think about all of that and mental health, we really have to get a ball on it, right? I don't want to take up too much time, but going back to the volunteering component of it, as I say, volunteering in communities and building trust. And given that even this time we know that kids, they fear the police, I think sometimes as allies, as white allies, whoever you are, external to vulnerable groups, coming into the community, be a part of the communities, right? In the Black communities I'm talking about, be a part of those healthcare centers, show up, bring your children. I'm not talking now in COVID, I'm talking when COVID is gone. Show up, be a part of the community, be engaged. And I think when you bring your children and you have these meaningful conversations, children will feel okay, and they'll realize that, okay, so not all police are bad, not all police are going to get me. And I think when we start doing stuff like that, it will, create a little bit more harmony and another step to change. I mean, we could go on and talk about more, but let me give it over to Shawnee.
Okay, thank you, Annette, for that very spirited conversation or answer. Okay, so we're wrapping up because we want to provide space for people to ask questions as well. But I want to present the following situations that, based on my work and from our discussions, for us to provide some quick strategies and answers. So starting off with it's COVID, or even outside of that, we'd already discussed the economic disparities in many Black communities, and we don't want to take these approaches from a middle class perspective. We recognize that many families are working 2 jobs or 1.5 jobs to make it, and to meet their basic needs, to have a living wage. They have to work 2 jobs to have a living wage. So what advice would you give to parents who are busy and do not have time or have the time to go out and seek some of the resources or some of the strategies that we've provided if they or their children are experiencing mental health issues?
Do you want me to start?
Sure, Mr. Leo, you can start. Oh, I should say Dr. Leo. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. So Audre Lorde, who was a feminist, a womanist, and a civil rights activist, I love her work. She's quite brilliant. She stated, self-care is not about self-indulgence. It is about self-preservation, and that in itself is a political act. So my interpretation of that is that your self-care is yours, that if you need to take a break, you need to take a break, and that in itself is a political action. Having said that, we talk about the system that we're in. So perhaps Black folks may not have access to insurance where they can afford private therapy, which is really expensive as it is. It means then we need to redefine or reimagine self-care. It needs to be decolonized. And some, I'll just talk about two quick ones that I practice in my own life and that I tell my clients, and it's from a real indigenous place. So for parents who feel quite stressed or quite worried, fuse, which is deeply connected to a thought, to a feeling that is causing them or their child to experience some distress. A practical strategy you can try, and over time you'll find that it's going to be more meaningful and useful. As you're cleaning your house, so the broom from African principle is very symbolic. It's about newness, it's about new beginning and those things. So while you're vacuuming or sweeping or doing your dishes, think about everything that's causing you stress and pain and worry. And as you engage in that act of sweeping, imagine you're sweeping that out as well, right? It gives some distance. It's called diffusion. So it gives you some distance from the issue that is causing you immediate distress. Another one is, so water in itself is a cleansing property. It's a cleansing agent. So just before you step in the shower, as you disrobe, think about, again, the stress that you're experiencing. Think about your worries. And as you shower, imagine as you bathe, imagine you're washing away as well the things that are distressing, and watch it go down the drain. Other thing could be music. I read a report in Ghana where they were doing circle drumming to a bunch of folks that was experiencing depression, and after beating the drums, they felt better. But it goes back to the question of who is conducting research and what is considered evidence and those things. There is tremendous power in our principles. We should rely on them, even if it's anecdotal. If it's meaningful, it's meaningful. So go back to music. I tell people all the time, my self-care is music. I love soca. I dance to soca. I'll take a pot, a beat in my house. It helps. Do something. Music is therapeutic. It takes you back to a happy place. How many of you remember Soul Train? Right? Maybe you guys may be too young, but Soul Train, people form a line and you dance, and it brings community, it brings this feeling of joy and celebration, which will give you some distance from what's causing mental distress. And those are just three real practical things that you don't have to pay a therapist for, that you can do in your own home.
If I may add to that very quickly, sorry to interrupt. If I may just add very quickly, the idea of mindfulness meditation as well is also important. I mean, it doesn't have to be the yoga that you know, but you can also meditate using prayer, right? So that's something that as Black people we are into, where we pray a lot, and so mindfulness meditation as a prayer, spiritual aspect of it can be used.
Okay, thank you. And I know Professor Hicklins celebrated, the late Professor Hicklins from Jamaica also spoke a lot about circling as a form of, strategies, and also drumming. He used a lot of drumming and circling in conversations to help with mental health. So you'll have to videotape yourself doing that pot knocking, Leo, for us to see, or just call us one day while you're doing it. Just say, I'm having a down day, and then you just provide the entertainment. Okay, all right, moving along. Thanks, Leo. Janelle, so I know we spoke about this a lot, even for our work. What about students who do not want to leave their homes because, as you related earlier, because of the murder of Black people by the police, and now because of COVID-19? What are the strategies that you could share with parents?
Yeah, so I think the strategies really go back to what the parents are already doing. So we learned so much from the parents in this program. And one example is a parent who started a balcony garden. And, that child and mom were able to start this balcony garden and watch it grow. And then I was able to integrate it into the lesson planning, where we're learning about science and the process and that sort of thing, which is really great. And then using exploratory questions. So Annette had spoke to this in the earlier CDI, Ask CDI session that we did. And the questions are very, engaging in terms of exploring, how do you feel about this issue? What triggered this feeling? Can you explain the feeling? And if the child doesn't want to respond, just let them know that they can revisit the topic whenever they're ready. And then trying to find ways to enhance emotional intelligence. So finding the support of others, for instance, the SNAP program, and also Delta Family Services. These are programs that can help, and kind of seeking out various programs and supports that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. One for you, Annette. So what about students who, they don't want to socialize or go outside? They don't want to socialize with other because of affairs, and they probably didn't have strong social skills, but COVID-19 and other forms of anti-Black racism has, exacerbated that fear. What are some strategies that parents?
Well, just to repeat some of what Janelle said, plus in addition, I'll add a few more points. I think key to that is if you notice that your child is having some of these issues where they're a little bit more introverted than normal, I think it's very, very important during this time to have this conversation with them. Keep asking them those same questions, those same probing questions about how they're feeling. Why are they feeling this? And, talk to them. They understand, no matter how young they are, they understand. They are hearing things, they're seeing things, because they'll eventually go back to school and you have to tell them, that they need to practice all these these rules that are out there. So at the end of the day, you need to sit down, have these conversations. And in addition to that, try within your own space. I know that I know that for some parents who are even single parents, especially if you're from low income background, maybe your space isn't big enough where you can respect space, where you can put your child in a different room. But the parents need that time for themselves as well. But find that time with your child to engage in some form of socialization. For those who have families who are external to even Canada, right? The internet is there. You can make a Zoom call, or you can use WhatsApp, a video call. Have those little conversations that allow them to relate to their families more. And also, doing some fun offline activities, like the scavenger hunt, right? And that will allow the kids to take their mind away. It's a shift away from all the anxiety and the pressure and, the depression, and thinking about what is happening around them. Because, kids have to be active. And that's another thing that they've been talking about as well. So, you can create the activities where you set the rules and you allow the kids to perhaps maybe go outside, to look for something, and they come back and they're online and they're being active, and allow them to also exercise. It's very, very important, being active. That's another thing as well. Because of the pandemic, people are sitting around their computers for hours, and stress, it presents itself in a gamut of ways. You can be overeating as well, right? So as parents, we have to also recognize some of these other things. If you see your child sitting down for too long, we know it's not necessarily good for your physical well-being. Engage them, move around. And more so, depending on where you're living, if you're even in an apartment building, say, honey, it's a good day. Put on your jacket. Let's go out and get out and take a walk. Put on your mask and these kinds of things. I know that they're scared to go outside, but remind them, I am with you. I'll protect you. And you have to gradually take them outside and help them to get accustomed, because eventually they'll be going back to school, right? So it's a gradual process. Unmute.
There. You think you get accustomed to this after being online for months? I am attended meetings, people at the CDI. I am, so I'm accustomed to unmuting. So while we wait on the questions, I just want to throw another one out there, because we have many lone parents families who tend to experience mental health issues, even at a greater extent than all things being considered, than people who would extended or families where there's more income to support these families. So what advice would you give for parents? And many of these families tend to be, mothers. They're fathers, but based on the research that I've looked at, I've seen where mothers are overrepresented. What advice would we give for lone parent families who have children experiencing mental health due to anti-Black racism? And I'll throw this open to anyone. Okay, I'll call a name, Janelle.
Okay. All right. So I think, yeah, that's a really important point, Shawnee, and question, because the issue is really, it's again systemic.
Mm-hmm.
We have a population where a lot of people, there are a lot more single parent homes, and these homes tend to be run overwhelmingly by women, even though they're single fathers. And that's a systemic issue. However, the issue of it that is systemic, I would say, is a lot of our systems, our services, our programs are still designed in a way that assumes that there are two-parent heteronormative homes, right? So we have this kind of blanket, I would say, system, if you would. So that disproportionately impacts children and families. So I would say some of the things that can be done is seeking additional support from extended family and community organizations. And like Annette said, like if families have the means to, going on WhatsApp calls, video calls. This is also a time where I've seen a lot of younger family members being able to connect with elders in places that are not within Canada, right? So trying to use the time to reach out to people. Another is kind of one of the issues is that a lot of single parent homes don't really have the resources of, let's say, other family members kind of jumping in or coming to take care of the child. Like, I can't imagine how my mom would have raised me under these circumstances right now if I had to just be in this very limited social bubble, right? So even if you look at like Thanksgiving for people that celebrate, where, in Ontario, people are being requested, the request or the direction is that you stay within your family household or bubble, right? So these are all things that take a toll on people and on families. So I would just say finding creative ways, if you have access to reach out to families and reach out to extended community members. And going back to the points that Annette and Leo made, that it takes a village. I really don't believe that one parent should have to raise the child on their own, or two parents even should raise one child on their own. I really believe that it does take a community. So I think tapping into those networks and encouraging communication and dialogue around issues around race and mental health and its impacts on mental health, and having, children say how they feel, right? Expressing themselves and having those conversations which engage your emotional intelligence and also challenge you on yours too. And then finally, parents need to recognize that the changes in their child or children's behavioral patterns. So pay attention to them. Don't dismiss these changes as well. I know within our community, there's often sometimes a fear around mislabeling, because there's so much mislabeling that goes on with our children within the education system, for example. But sometimes there are also times where we need to seek out the right resources and ask for help, and also seek the right supports. And when we seek the supports for our children, it needs to be reciprocated on the other end. And it shouldn't be, people on the other end saying, well, I don't see race and all people are the same. That's very problematic, and that's very troubling, because then they cannot provide adequate supports, which is Black focused and Black centered, right? So I would just say that in asking Black communities and families to seek supports, we also need to ask that whoever is providing the supports, administration, educators, social workers, they also need to take those Afrocentric approaches that Leo had mentioned as well.
Okay, thank you. Such a rich discussion. We have to have you guys again. Nod. So I'll give you the floor, Annette and Leo, for final remarks before we open up to questions. So I see a lot of people are commenting on the usefulness of your discussion. So just final closing remarks, if there's anything that you think you'd like to add to this, or a final thought that you didn't share.
Can I just quickly make mention of, for those parents with children and their co-parenting, the co-parenting aspect of it? I think that's an important thing that we need to think about. Remember that co-parenting can be challenging even in this time, right? Especially when the parents have contradicting parenting styles. And, if let's say that you're with someone who's also from a different culture, I think what is important is that we show respect in terms of communication and be consistent. I think that is essential to, good parenting, and recognizing that the child's needs must be met first. How you would have dialogue with each other is important for their mental health, especially within the Black community, right? Another thing I think perhaps we should reinforce when Janelle talks about seeking that help in a Black community and in other communities as well, there's this issue around stigma around mental health. We need to see how we can destigmatize these ideas that if you're having depression, or if you're anxious, or if you're feeling down, I can't afford to tell you that comes with issues of trust and fear. And so we have to see how we can help each other, even as allies, how you can, try and see how you can direct the person into that area where they perhaps can get that needed help. And I know that resources are scarce in certain areas where perhaps Black families don't want to go and see a white psychologist. That is why, representation matters. But I'm making the point that mental health is no joke, and we need to move away from the stigma. Educate yourself, educate your children from an early age. It is important, it's critical for their development and for your own development as well. If you are unwell, then your kids are going to be unwell because you won't be able to be there for them. So that's my final word. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Preach, sister. Okay, Leo.
Yep, my final word, and I'll be really brief, that in addition to the racism, systemic and personal, in addition to the discrimination in education, in health, across the justice system, that Black folks remain resilient and strong and steadfast. But I want to highlight as well that it's possible to hold both, to be resilient and to feel pain and to reach out for help. That this notion that we're strong and we're not supposed to feel emotions and those things isn't helping. The only way to deal and to address psychological and mental stress is to acknowledge that it exists. And so while we continue to stand up against a system that is oppressive, while we continue to stand up individually and collectively as a people, it'll be really important, going back to my dear friend Adri Lord, that we take care of ourselves individually and collectively. Our mental health matters. It matters as our physical health. And I encourage us as Black folks to really shift the dial and to create a space and an environment where we can talk about mental health as we would talk about any other issue, because our mental health indeed matters.
Thank you. And of course, this would take a decolonization approach. Of course, I want to emphasize that a lot of these, our inability to talk about a lot of these issues come from over 400 years of an institution being placed upon us where we were not allowed to be sick. And the only thing, our utility came and value came in the fact that we can be strong. So how do we then undo these in when we were colonized and made slaves for much longer than we got emancipation. So it's going to take, and I know this is centered in your work too, so it's going to take a lot of those undoing decolonization and real conversation about hurt and trauma, and a lot of that, where when I think from my own perspective growing up, when you are when you're trying to make it economically, you're afraid of breaking down. So these things need to come hand in hand, because who's going to be there when, as you say, you address some of these issues, and it seems as if based on the stigma that now you're going to unfold. So who's going to provide that support, and how do you provide that space where people can talk about this and still carry on the next day, because they have their families to feed. So these are a lot of deep conversations that we need to have. But I'll leave it. I see your hand, Miss Annette, but I want to see if there's questions, because we do want our audience and the people, the nice people at home, to ask questions of us. The nice and lovely people at home. Okay, so perhaps you can make your comment while we wait on the questions.
No, I was just going to say, that, based on what Leah's even saying, just as how you go to the doctor and they tell you you have cancer, or you have diabetes, and you have high blood pressure, mental health should be taken just with the same urgency, with the same care, and, self-love.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I see Baden saying no comment questions. Says, yeah, just people commenting that they love the insights and agree wholeheartedly. Right. So well, thank you very much for everyone who has joined the panel. We'll give it another minute if people don't have questions, but perhaps we will share how people could get in contact with us, especially you, Mr. Dr. Leo, to have those continued conversation. Do you want to share that information? And I'm sure Baden will have the opportunity to share that information further too. But just for the people listening at home, how do they get in contact with you, your knowledgeable self?
Thank you. Thank you for your kindness, Shawnee. Make me really happy. I'm smiling inside and outside as well. So they can check out my website, capabilityfirst.com. And the name as well is very intentional. I think a lot of time we pay attention to people's disability. So yeah, check out capabilityfirst.com, and you'll be able to reach me. My contact is on that website. Or Psychology Today.
You can type it in the chat so that Baden can post it. Janelle, do you also have a website, Janelle?
Yep. It's in the process of being updated, but it's janellebrady.ca. And I'll share that. I'm also sharing the book that I referenced, that Carl James was an author on, a co-editor on. Yeah.
And Annette?
You can actually reach me at annette.walker6@gmail.com. You're muted, Shawnee.
Here we go again. Okay, thank you very much. So if people want to get in contact with us, that's how they connect with us. Thank you very much for your time, Janelle, Annette, and Leo. I look forward to having a similar conversation with you, but sometimes next year, because I think we need a little break from for the rest of the year. All right, thank you, and have a good day. Bye. Oh, Baden said there's a question that came through. Okay, let's wait on it. Okay, Baden. What advice do you have for parents of Black children in a SNAP program who need to address an aggressive racist incident perpetrated by a peer with educators? or generally not just SNAP? What advice do you have for parents of Black children in a SNAP program or generally who need to address an aggressive racist incident perpetrated by a peer? So just to provide some context, are you saying that this happened in a school-based program? When you said it's by educators. But just let's wait until we get the clarification. What advice would you give for parents of Black children who okay, so it happened in a school setting. So they experienced an aggressive racist incident by a peer. What advice would you give? Let's start first with Janelle, and then we go to Annette and Leo.
Yeah, so I think if the child is in the SNAP program, they do have a lot of supports and supports from the clinicians, the clinical team, the CDI team more widely, and the tutor, if they're in the CSA program, the tutor can also support them. So whenever incidents come up like that, I would say to let someone know and see if they can support you with getting in touch with the educator, so perpetrated by a peer with educators. That's where, I'm sorry, that could be on my end, but that part I'm unclear about. If it's the peer who perpetrated the incident, or was the educator just on standby? Now, if the educator was just...
Also,
how would you bring it up with
teacher?
Okay, thanks, Shawnee. Yeah, so if it wasn't the same said teacher involved, I would say definitely to document the experience, to write it down, save it on a Word file, also get something in writing to the educator. If it was that same educator or teacher, then I would say to present it to the principal. If you're not having a good response from the principal, then you could channel it up to the superintendent and or the school trustee. So I would say to use the channels of advocacy with regards to how to deal with the issue. And you can quote, like, let's say if it's the Toronto District School Board, you can quote some of their mandate around racial, anti-Black racism or racial inequities and the equity inclusion policy from way back 2009 to justify what you want to say. But you can always tap on the supports of clinicians who can advocate on your behalf and with you, with the educators.
Okay, thank you. Annette?
Well, I support what Janelle is actually saying. And since the child made that report to the parent, I think from the onset too, the parent should have that conversation with the child about what happened, but try not to make too much of a big judgment as yet before meeting with the relevant people in charge. And perhaps explore, because we're looking at mental health, and it's important that we explore how our kids feel when they experience certain things, So explore how the child felt, etc., and see how best you can perhaps find, that support to help them, guide them as well.
We go again. I think it's also important once the issue is brought to the teacher, is that we use a form of restorative justice. Now I know that the incident might have been aggressive, so there'll be opportunities for the child, the perpetrator, or the person who committed this act to apologize, and following the SNAP program, ask them to create a plan that can work for them and to make the problem smaller, not bigger. And the person who this was done to, the victim, then has to agree if that plan also works for them. But it's important that there's a restorative piece, and I want to acknowledge that I also find out what's going on with the other child, why they would have committed this act. Perhaps there are underlying issues there. So having that conversation where both parties are made to explain how they feel in a restorative way, following even Afrocentric principles of Ubuntu. using that restorative justice and that restorative approach to get answers and to heal, because this emphasis on aggression means that the person was hurt. But I want to say that the other person who committed this act is experiencing some form of hurt too. So how do we make it that is restorative and they get justice for both person, even though we want the other person, the person that this was done to feel safe. I see that, Leo, you have identified one. How do you distinguish between, and we're wrapping up soon, how do you distinguish between white and Black mental health?
Thanks. I'll be really, really brief. So mental health doesn't discriminate. So it doesn't matter if you're Black or white. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. What's important is that the way we respond to mental health might be different, and our access to support might be very different. So it's a matter of the response and then considering the other socioeconomic issues that may play into a particular group experiencing a mental health presentation that might be a bit more pervasive, but there isn't a clear distinction between white and Black mental health.
Thank you. So we want to identify that, even though we're talking about mental health and anti-Black racism, we're tying to anti-Black racism because of this years and years and years. The research has shown where stress can be imprinted. I don't want to use the wrong term, but imprinted on your bodies because of generational trauma, and this is not only in Black communities, but you find it in communities who have experienced stress, ongoing stress, which a lot of Black people have experience. So it's not a surprise then, or a rabbit pulled out of a hat, that we experience certain level of trauma and even like certain principles. Like I see one question here about an individual asking to address if a Black child draws himself as white when coloring. They said it concerns them, but they're not sure how to address the situation. So even that internalization of what beauty is and the standards, that I see coming from this question is not because of something that happens, right? It's something that's done to us. Like if I'm going somewhere, I have to ensure that I present a particular way. I went to City Hall for a meeting, and when I gave them my name, and doctor came up, they're like, "Oh, you're a doctor." I'm like, okay, so not because I'm not wearing certain clothes that I don't look like what doctor looks like, and that affects your self-confidence. Like these little innocuous things, like you have to present as doctor or you have to present as professional for people to take you seriously. These things affect your mental health, right? Okay, Janelle, you had one, and hopefully we can address the question because I'm going off again.
Yeah. No, this is in reference to the question, and it's just a segue from what you were saying as well, Shawnee. So in terms of the differentiation, it's that we often, our systems take what's referred to as a color-blind approach, and sometimes I'm wary of using that terminology to reinforce ableist tropes, but it takes this approach where whiteness is seen as neutral, and people think they're being nice or caring as social workers, as clinicians, if they say that they do not see race. So going back to what Shawnee says, we need to acknowledge the histories that have brought us to where we are, and if you have ways of integrating Black representation in terms of mental health, even if it's a mental health day campaign, the posters that you select in terms of the people who are being represented, if you have Black faces on those posters and it's for Black children, my goodness, the response that you're going to get from these kids is just uncanny, right? So we need to think about that in very intentional ways, and we need to differentiate between our lived realities and say that our experiences are not all the same. The other piece is tying to the question regarding a Black child drawing themselves as white when coloring. And I think many of us as Black children went through this phase or experience. I remember at one point I was drawing myself as blonde with yellow, right? blonde hair. Why was that? It's because I grew up on Disney princesses and I internalized, as Shawnee said, those norms and those tropes of beauty. And these are things that we need to be active and intentional in dismantling. We cannot dismantle a system of racism, systemic racism and white supremacy if we're going to shy away from it. But with reference to that child, I would say bombard them with images of themselves. Have them see themselves represented and reflected. And our previous CDI, Ask CDI talk really addresses this. So have them see, think about the books that you have in your home. Think about the shows that they're watching. Do they see themselves, right? And I'll just share something that hopefully can be shared with folks and the person that asked this question. And it's a book that was written by Thalia Bennett, who is a Whitby therapist. And the book is called Imani Goes to School. And it's a culturally responsive book, which features a Black child, a Black young girl, who faces anxiety about going back to school. And because the author of the book is a therapist and a Black woman, she was really able to couch it in the experience of Blackness and also in the experience of mental health. So I think books like those are really important, and ensuring that children see themselves. And I've heard stories from educators where they've had those issues come up in the school, and then they've spent like 4 or 6 months just bombarding the kids with like books where they see Indigenous characters and Black characters. There's so much out there. Then you see those issues start to go away. And going back to the point that Annette said, having those conversations, having those frank discussions with children as well around racism, how they see themselves, how they see the world, and not taking that colorblind approach, or what's called, better yet, race evasive approach. That's a better terminology to use now. I think that's all important to do to address that issue.
Yeah. You're on mute. Unmute yourself.
I'll give you the last
So two things. I know that some of our kids are in sports, girls and boys, and Janelle just spoke about, the use of books and other resources. I know that Kobe Bryant, who recently passed away, he has a podcast. I listened to it. It's very interesting, named Punies. It's all about Black characters, teaching them about working in groups, loving themselves, etc. And he also has books that are available online. And the other thing, going back to that question about white and Black mental health, I think for a long time, and I know that perhaps Leo can attest to this, for a long time, how Black people were diagnosed in mental, among psychiatrists and psychologists psychiatrists was totally different, right? They were diagnosed as schizophrenic, while white people were diagnosed as, bipolar. So these are some of the other things that really, look at some of the injustices and the racism towards Black people, right? Especially when it comes to mental health. And that is why even now, my last point, that is why even now you have even the Black community, they don't trust, taking vaccines and all these things because we're used as experiments before, right? So these are some of the things that we as Black people go through. Thank you, guys.
Here, thank you very much for everyone who tuned in. I suspect this is the end of the questions. I don't see anyone anymore coming in. So thank you very much for listening to us for over an hour and a half. We hope that you find the information informative. And we hope to engage with you at some other point in the future. Thank you very much and have a good night. Bye.